Okay.
Hi, I'm Jane Stevens. I'm here this morning to worship with you all, as well as to tell you a little bit about what's happening at Amani and at New Life Home this year and during COVID season. We were in Kenya in February when COVID hit, and I can remember reading about it in the Nairobi Journal, and Kenya was terrified by COVID from the first moment. There was no lull in their awareness. I think because of that HIV crisis, which had such an impact and such a power for stigmatization and isolating them from the rest of the world. So as soon as the president got wind of it, he did a severe lockdown on the country. They couldn't go between cities. The kids all had to come home from school. Schools were closed for a year, even back then. And there was a curfew, a 7 o'clock curfew, which often was very brutal because it was hard for workers in Kenya always to get home on time. They had to rely on walking and on public transportation. And the police could be really brutal in those cases. So the whole country was quite frightened by the disease. And in fact, more frightened by the response to the disease, I think, than the disease at first. And yet, over months, Kenya's done pretty well. They've done better than Europe and the US. For one thing, they have a much younger population. But New Life Home immediately began stockpiling food for the babies. When we left, all 4 homes were filled up with brand new abandoned infants. So they needed formula. Formula is an imported thing, so they had to stockpile it before the prices went way up, and they began doing that. They didn't expect that they would be able to have any more adoptions. None of us knew how long, of course, COVID would last, but with the terror going on in Kenya, nobody dreamed that somebody would adopt a child or that any of the children that they had there would not be there at the end of COVID. But the big surprise and the great news was that even in the pandemic, from the beginning, Kenyan families kept adopting babies. They knew that it was a terrible time and there was little they could do. But I think just like in America, it made them realize even more how much they needed their families. So adoptions kept going. People would get a police guard to take them across the city to meet their baby and to spend time with it and ultimately to adopt. So with that happening, then there were beds available in the 4 homes at New Life Home. And Janet, the director, and the staff were confronted with the challenge that that's what they were there for. They're there to take care of abandoned infants. And there were more abandoned infants in Kenya after the first month of COVID than any other time. They were just being stacked up in hospitals. No homes were taking abandoned children during the lockdown. And the hospitals would call and call and call about the babies they had. So New Life Home put their head together to figure out a way that they could take babies in. One of the things that's a little different about COVID in Kenya is there's a huge sense of stigmatization for being sick. Again, I think because of HIV. So if you're a nurse and you work in a hospital that takes care of COVID patients, you would hide that from your neighbors, because if your neighbors find out that you're working in a hospital that has COVID patients, even if you have nothing to do with them, they will shun you. They might follow you home and not let you come into your house. They might harass your family and do everything they can to get you out of your home. And it's somewhat tribal, but it's basically a health stigma, which is, I guess we have some of that, but it's at a whole new level. So Janet and the staff had to protect the staff against that stigma, but at the same time bring children in who were of unknown background. And the place that it was in the sort of refugee centers, the makeshift shanties, was where a lot of the COVID was, and that's where a lot of the babies come from. So it was, everybody assumed that if you brought babies in, you were bringing COVID in. But nonetheless, Janet and her group figured out a plan. This was a plan. They would get cohorts, one baby to one staff member. They asked for volunteers, and all of the people who did this did it as volunteers, which is really extraordinary. And then they would take them they would bring babies in. They would take them to another place that nobody knew about. And they called it sealing them into the ark. They would go into, often it might be individual little rooms, or it might be a room for all 6 of them. But they would have a Jiko, a little burner for cooking food, a bag of frozen food, or they don't have ice chests, they have ice bags, and diapers and food for the baby, and a bed for themselves. And I don't know where, I guess maybe baby beds, but I have a feeling the baby was literally with them constantly. Because these are brand new babies, they were, babies need help all the time when they're brand new, plus many of them were sick and they didn't have any aid, they didn't particularly have medical help unless it was a real crisis. But God be praised, there were no crises, and after 2 weeks, they opened the ark and everybody came out, and Kenya can celebrate like nobody's business. So there's great celebration when they brought the aunties and the babies to the home, and they tested them, and they were all negative. Had they been positive, the plan was they would go back into isolation for another 2 weeks. So when these volunteers signed up for this, they signed up for 4 weeks of isolation with babies that they didn't know, who had tremendous needs and no way to have any of their normal life or see their own families. The heroism of those women just amazes me. I'm always amazed by New Life Home, but this chapter has given me a whole new sense of how extraordinary these women are. And the first cohort had 6 babies from Nairobi, and they tested them. The one limitation of the project is that tests cost $100. So every time there's a move, they have to test the babies and the aunties. And had they more resources for tests, they would do more. But even nonetheless, they had great success, and they had, I think, 12 different cohorts from the 4 homes go through this summer. And every time it gets a little easier and a little more normalized, but it's still got to be very secretive, and each volunteer takes on a lot of risk. And yet, had they not done that, this would have been a season not just of terror and sickness across the country, but of ultimate death for these new babies. There was no place for them. So that's New Life Home. When we started Amani in 2004, one of the first churches we met was New Philadelphia. And I went to your mission committee and told them about the babies. And of course, I just was amazed by how they responded. In the years since, I've gone to many mission committee meetings, and I have sat with your committees, and I don't know of any other church who takes their missions more seriously. They would have each group representative come in throughout the year. They asked incredibly insightful questions, and then they prayed together and decided what they could do for each group. About 4 years ago, they asked me to stay. For some reason, I stayed for the rest of the meeting. And at that point, I saw how limited the resources were that they were dealing with. And I can remember driving home, overwhelmingly humbled that they would choose year after year to care for these babies whom they would never see. I mean, it's very natural for our mission committee to want to support a kid's trip or something that they can see in Winston-Salem. But year after year, New Philadelphia has supported the weakest and the most needy, and nobody outside of the church knows about it. I think that's what God means for us to do with missions. Thank you for inviting me.